So there's a lot of things that have been going on in the space. I mean, the Samouri Wallet guys were arrested. Phoenix and Async have exited the US. Wasabi has exited the US. There's the Roger Ver arrest as well. What are you making of all this?
Yeah, I think that it's not coincidental, but maybe a surprise to some people that these actions that you're really kind of the specific action that the Department of Justice, Southern District of New York has taken against the Samouri Wallet founders and operators comes just on the heel of the Bitcoin ETF being approved and launched in the subsequent months. I do think that, having that and keeping that in context, because when the Bitcoin ETF was launched, it was really approved, or the series of ETFs that were launched that followed the approval by the SEC. The SEC approved that begrudgingly, and that there's other interests in the United States. Someone who's very vocal in opposition to Bitcoin is someone like Senator Warren, and that it's also not surprising that the Department of Justice and likely allies within the U.S. Treasury Department and FinCEN would ramp up their essentially legislation by prosecutorial discretion and by enforcement actions. So I think that my personal perspective is there's a lot to digest in the Samouri case. It does seem like it's going to have a chilling effect, and that I think that you though also have to look at every individual circumstance differently and uniquely. I think that Samouri is certainly different from Phoenix pulling out of the U.S., and it's certainly, even though Wasabi Wallet operated a mixer similar to Samouri, it was different. And I think that I don't fault someone who's running Wasabi from doing that, but just also recognizing that each company's facts and circumstances are different. And then when you then compare individual companies and the nature of their services to other companies that are entirely different and not similar, that they shouldn't all be lumped together. I do think that there's the possibility that people overreact, but I also think that it is a good stress test. Not that certainly not wanting anything bad to happen to any individuals, but I think it is really going to have the broader effect, even if the near-term impact may be chilling the type of activities or even what people are willing to say about it in the U.S., that in the end, in an aggregate, the consequence will be that everyone has just gotten a kind of shot across the bow, a very loud signal, and that combination of the way things build people, or the way people build tools, as well as at the individual level, to groups of people becoming more active in defending the rights of Bitcoin and Bitcoin holders within the United States and abroad, will be heightened as a result of this. So I do ascribe, not to make light of it at all, but in the economic theory that Keynesians push, that everything is good for Bitcoin. And that in this case, everything being good for Bitcoin, meaning that the tools that get built will be built more consciously given the latest sets of actions. But then also, I think it will become a call to action that people within the Bitcoin community need to not just be more proactive, because I think there has been a lot of advocacy, but needs to be a lot more strategic and recognize that we're playing for keeps now, and that this also wouldn't be happening if the legacy financial system wasn't weak, wasn't fragile, wasn't tenuous itself, and that at some point, I think everyone realistically knew that these type of things would happen, and happen in an accelerating way, maybe just not as soon as today.
Yeah, and so you made a good point around the way tools have been built in this ecosystem, and I think we should go into that a little bit, because now, to be clear, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert on the US regulatory environment, but as I understand it, FinCEN came out with some guidance, and some of that guidance has been followed over the years in terms of how products and services were built in this ecosystem. So I will point out that sometimes people confuse the term mixer with CoinJoin or non-custodial CoinJoin, and I think there is a difference in the way some of these services were constructed. So as an example, Samouri Wallet, Wasabi Wallet, Join Market, these are non-custodial tools, and there is a difference of character in that the user who holds those private keys is, obviously they're using these coordinating softwares, whether it's Samouri or Wasabi, to self-send, in a CoinJoin fashion, but that has historically been seen as different to, let's say, custodial mixes. And so I know there was the Bitcoin Fog case, and I believe Chip Mixer, and so in those cases, historically, the courts saw a difference there between a custodial mixer and a non-custodial service. And you could also argue that many services that have been built with that kind of self-custodial focus, right, whether it's Unchained Capital or others out there that have designed their service in this way. What do you think it means now that the US government seemingly, or at least the prosecutors, are trying to overturn this or go back on what was previously FinCEN guidance?
Yeah, and I think that there's a few things that I would say kind of on the front side, which I agree with you completely, that the way things are built and the nature of the service is and the facts and circumstances, which someone like FinCEN or DOJ or anyone would specifically say that it's specific to the facts and circumstances of a certain service, a certain tool, a certain company. I think that there are a few things that are at play, and one of the things that when I read through some excerpts, I read through the full indictment, but I believe there have been responses to the Samouri case. I haven't read the full response, but I did go back and reread the 2019 guidance. Is that there's a difference between law, there's a difference between rules making, there's a difference between guidance from FinCEN, and then there's a difference between the DOJ and the Department of Justice, and there can be areas within both rules making and guidance, as well as selective prosecution, that interpret laws that can stretch the meaning of those laws or the intentionality of what was meant. And then those are all ultimately tested in the court system. And that I think, again, and I'm not a lawyer, but recognizing that FinCEN, because basically what the Department of Justice is saying is that, FinCEN is not necessarily the authority on this, which throws everybody into chaos, because we're all from people. When I say we, anybody who's building infrastructure within the United States is relying upon the guidance that the Financial Crimes and Enforcement Network, that is a unit of the U.S. Treasury Department, is sending out. They're sending out their interpretation of the law, and then in this case, the Department of Justice has functionally interpreted the law different than, or in conflict or in contradiction to what the Treasury and the Treasury Department and FinCEN has said. And so when I personally read the FinCEN guidance, and again, they were from 2019, we're in 2024. Typically, if there's an update to guidance, they will update it, but that is also one other caveat, that 5 years has changed. And, if their interpretation has changed, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to put out, a new set of guidance, even though that is traditional practice. Is that in that guidance, they specifically talk about anonymizing services. And then they differentiate that from anonymizing software. Right. And so basically, and they distinguish, and one of the things in my own interpretation, I think this is something that everyone who's building infrastructure to serve the Bitcoin community or Bitcoin holders in the United States, but particularly everywhere, needs clarity on, is in the FinCEN guidance from 2019, and then also in private letter rulings that they had linked in that guidance, they specifically refer to money transmission as accepting and transmitting. And that it's both of those things together. You accept funds and then you transmit funds. You accept funds from one person and you transmit funds from another. What the Department of Justice is trying to seemingly stretch the definition or potentially change the meaning of a law or of a statute is saying that you don't actually have to accept and transmit to be a money transmitter. And then if you are a money transmitter and you don't have the proper licenses, then you've committed a crime. And so understanding this important distinction that based on everything that FinCEN had put out, and then there were also in these private letter rulings where they would expressly say, you never had control of funds, you never control funds, therefore you're not a money transmitter. And then when you think about that in the context of the Samouri case, that they never were in control of funds, and the Department of Justice admits such, they're trying to change the scope of what the word money transmission means. And, creating law, in my personal view, creating law via enforcement actions and criminal complaints is not the right way to create law. We might not agree with a law that said, any coin join service, whether custodial or non-custodial in the United States, is not lawful. We might not agree with that, and then that could be challenged. But then at least there would be a law that states that, passed by legislators, not the interpretation of one district in the state of New York. And so my reading of it says, when they talk about anonymizing services, they say anonymizing services are money transmission, but it doesn't talk about, who's running a server or not. It specifically talks about accepting and transmitting funds. Basically establishing that, if you were to read that text, that their definition of anonymizing services would be a custodial service. And then when they talk about the fact that, anonymizing software and it depends on who's running the software and whether the person running the software is a money transmitter, but the software itself is not money transmission. And so such that if you developed a tool and then open sourced it, and then the Samouri case seems to fit in a gray area, but where there is a gray area in terms of the interpretation, to anyone that I think, setting aside the Samouri case, because I do think there's specific circumstances set out to them that make them unique, is this lack of clarity on this idea of can you be a money transmitter if you never touch any money? Because to a common sense person, they would say certainly not. Based on all FinCEN guidance that previously existed, it would say certainly not. And based on FinCEN private letter rulings, it would say not. And in that case, I would also be very surprised if there's ever been a DOJ case against somebody accusing them of violating a money transmission law without having ever been in possession of funds. So I think that certainly when you read through the indictment of Samouri, that complaint, that what is at the forefront is the money laundering aspect of it. Their alleged knowledge of that activity ongoing on their platform, and then not taking steps to prevent that. I think that absent those facts and circumstances, it would be very difficult to conceive a case like this being brought against somebody else that wasn't in possession of money, and that doesn't make their complaint valid. I think it just is a kind of more broad recognition that if not for the other elements of what they allege, specifically related to money laundering, would this case be brought? But then it becomes certainly relevant to everybody building, to people like Phoenix, to people like Wasabi Wallet. Wasabi Wallet looks a lot similar. Again, facts and circumstances of their business very different than Samouri, but similar at the same time, and different just in terms of how the tools work. So ultimately, I think that what it will come down to, or my perspective, or where everyone would gain clarity, is this definition of money transmission, and also recognizing that for that to change, a a statute really needs to change, and that's law, and we could either agree or disagree with it, challenge that, but that to me seems the right way to carry forward. And so I would caution people not to overreact, but to start taking it extremely seriously and start becoming very active in terms of advocacy. And my perspective on that is that we need a new class of advocates that are just Bitcoin focused, that don't lump Bitcoin in with everything else, because everything is so different when you get into facts and circumstances just within Bitcoin and the different segments of how Bitcoin works, and also its significance and just size and merits its kind of being legislated or regulated on its own and not confused with everything else that exists in the world.